One of my favorite things in the miniature hobby is making bases for my models. Now, over the years, I have made dozens and dozens of different types of bases because I tend to like to switch it up and make it so that every crew and every army has a unique basing scheme that's not exactly the same as any of the others that I've done before. I find it really fun, but one of the interesting things is that I've learned a ton of lessons over the years about how to get a better result when I'm making my bases. So today I want to just go over 5 things to avoid doing, or put more positively, 5 tips to get a better result and make your bases look that much cooler. These are all pretty simple things. They're kind of bigger ideas that you can sort of implement in lots of different ways. It's not going to be specifics, but hopefully each of these can be used to sort of step your basing game up and help you improve and make it a little bit more fun for you. But now let's get right into the list. So I'm going to start with a showstopper here, and I think this might be the most important tip and the most important thing that I have learned throughout my base making career. One of the worst things that you can do is make a base that is completely flat, especially if you're talking about a natural base. If you go look out in nature, there's very few places where you're going to see things that are entirely flat. People sometimes call this the parking lot effect, where you just put a bunch of sand down on a flat base, and it it's better than no base at all, but it really looks plain and unexciting. There's a ton of different ways that you can try to address this problem, but one of the things that I find is really useful is just to build up a rounded sort of convex surface to put your basing material on. Even just a teeny little bit of a raised area in the middle of the base is going to make it look a lot more dynamic, and it's also going to have the effect of propping the miniature up and making them look a little bit more prominent and a little bit bolder. You want them to kind of sit proud and not look like they're sunken into the base, unless it's a type of base where you want them to look sunken into it. Obviously, that's an exception. There's a lot of different materials out there that you can use to sort of put down as the structure of the base. I know a lot of people like to use green stuff or milliput or air drying clay. There's a ton of different things that people will use. And I'll be honest, I've tried all of those things, and I found that the one that works the best for me is something called Magic Sculpt. Now, there's a couple of reasons why I like this better than some of the alternatives. Number one, you get a pretty good amount of it for the price. You don't have to spend $10 on a teeny little strip of green stuff that's going to work for 5 bases, and then you're going to have to get more. It's got a pretty decent length working time, meaning that you can sort of play with it and move it around and then still use it to sort of sink pieces into even after you've done a whole bunch of bases. It's not going to dry super quick. And it's very workable. It kind of, the texture reminds me a little bit more of something like a milliput, but I find that it's a little less soluble than milliput. It doesn't tend to disintegrate when you wet it. And so it's sort of like a middle point between a milliput and a green stuff, but definitely closer to the milliput if you're familiar with that stuff. I really like it. You can get a tub of it for a reasonable price. It's a little bit hard to find in the United States, but I actually found a place in New York City not too far away that sells it, so I'll leave a link in the description below. I decided to grab a pretty big tub of it because I've been using it on pretty much every base that I've been making lately. And it's definitely going to cost more than a small thing of green stuff, but like I said, the idea here is that it's going to go for much longer. If you are doing a bigger project or you like to just have this stuff on hand ready to go for all sorts of base making in the future, then definitely go for a couple pounds of this stuff because it's going to work really well. But back to the subject of making your convex bases, another cool thing that you can do with this is sort of mix it up a little bit and add a little bit of variety in the type of textures that the ground is going to be made out of. So you can have one that's just convex in the middle. You can have it go a little higher, a little lower. You can mix it up and have the edges of the base be a little higher or have different bumps. You can kind of play with it and get creative. And one of the things that I like to do when I'm making bases for a crew or for an army is to add some variety. Even though it's going to be the same theme, you want to have them all look a little bit different. If every single base is identical, it doesn't look realistic when you're looking at the army or the crew as a whole. So doing something like adding some elevation to the base, it makes it really easy to mix it up. You can have every single base be slightly different but still look like it comes from the same place. Looks like they're in the same setting, and I think it's a really cool option to get that stuff done really quick. Number 2 here is all about the cork. Now, I think that if you want to frame this as a mistake, I think the mistake is not using cork. Cork is super versatile. It's a great material to use for making all different types of bases. But to frame it more positively, I think that my tip would be use the cork. Definitely get yourself some cork sheets. They are super awesome. But also be deliberate about the way that you're using the cork. One of the mistakes that I think a lot of people make is to just slap the cork down on the base and then put some paint over it and call it done. And that might get the effect that you're looking for in some cases. I've definitely done that before and been reasonably happy with it, but oftentimes when you do that, you're going to really know that it's cork. When you're looking at it, it's going to look like a little piece of cork that you ripped out and then glued your model on top of. So there's a lot of different techniques that you can use to sort of hide the fact that it's cork. You can use some texture paste to put over the cork and kind of disguise the material itself. You can even just seal it up with something like Mod Podge so that it takes the paint a little bit better and hides some of the texture that the cork naturally brings out. Or you can even partially cover it with some other materials to sort of make it blend in and look a little bit more like a natural landscape. Now, the cool thing about cork is that it can be used for a whole bunch of different things. So you can make cork look like rock formations, you can make it look like cliff sides, you can make it look like more natural terrain or sort of decayed organic material like tree stumps and stuff like that. Or you can even make it look like concrete or a paved street. But another thing you want to be careful about is if you get cork sheets, depending on the thickness, you may want to stack some of them on top of each other to add a little bit of a thicker base underneath the model. And when you lay them on top of each other, you're going to see this very obvious seam between the two layers. It's super important, even if you're not going to cover the rest of the cork and you like that sort of natural texture that it brings, you want to make sure you use some sort of filler to fill in those seams, because that's going to look super, super obvious and it'll stand out from a distance even across the tabletop. Straight lines in nature look super unnatural and they are going to be kind of an eyesore. Like I said, it'll stand out quite a bit against the rest of this sort of beautiful natural terrain. So make sure you go in there with some filler, some grout, some Mod Podge, some texture paste, whatever it is that you have on hand, just to fill in those gaps and make sure that there's no visible seam. If you're enjoying this video and you want to support the channel, then there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. The first would be to pick up some merchandise through my merch store. You can grab a t-shirt, a hoodie, a mug, a sticker, all sorts of cool stuff like that. You can also shop using my affiliate links, so if you're going to make any purchases from any of these companies, you can use the links in the description below to make your purchases, and it will go directly to supporting the channel at no extra cost to you. There's also a link for my Ko-fi if you would just like to give me a tip, or my Patreon if you want to support me longer term. I have a bunch of different tiers there, and there are all sorts of benefits available to people, such as early access to videos, ad-free videos, the opportunity to vote in polls about upcoming content, and extra entries into the giveaways that I run occasionally. But if none of that is your cup of tea, no problem at all. Just make sure that you're subscribed to the channel and leave a like on the video. It actually helps a tremendous amount. And if you want to go the extra mile, then consider sharing the video out with some friends who you think might find it interesting. The YouTube algorithm is not kind to small YouTubers, so that helps a whole bunch. Other than that, consider joining the Discord, also linked in the description, where you can come and hang out with me and the rest of the community and talk games. But with that, let's get right back to the video. One of the big mistakes that I think I've made in my basing is to be a little bit too timid and not go aggressive enough in filling in some interesting things on the base. So for example, if you're doing something like a junkyard base or a wasteland or a ruined city, I think it will serve you well to really be aggressive and fill in that base with lots of different stuff. Sometimes when I'm doing a base like this, I'll put in one or two different elements and think, I want the focus to be on the model, and there is something to be said for that. But if you leave most of the ground uncovered and it's just bare dirt, it's not really going to have the same effect of looking like a junkyard or a ruined city or whatever it is that you're going for. I find that it's really hard to overdo this. You really can just pile stuff on and make it look like a big mound of stuff that your model is walking over. And as long as you don't make it too tall and you don't make the scaling strange compared to the model itself, I think you really can't go wrong with adding more stuff here. You can go with multiple layers, you can get different types of materials, so some natural materials, some manufactured materials. You can have things that are dirty and broken and twisted, and you can really get creative and make some really interesting different combinations of things. But I think what you don't want to do is you don't want to be too restrained and not put enough stuff. Get in there and go crazy and pile that stuff on, because when it's all said and done, it's going to look really cool and thematic. Just don't make the mistake that I have made before and not leave space for your model's feet, because if you can't put the model on the base at the end of the day, then you did a lot of work for nothing. Now, something that I was pretty reluctant to do when I first got into base making was making artificial bases. And what I mean by that is something that is not based in nature. So it's not just like dirt or a landscape or desert or something like that. So I'm thinking of things like temple floors or a spaceship deck or some sort of building interior. And the reason that I was reluctant to do that is because when you're making a base that's supposed to look like it's manufactured or constructed in the universe, you want to be a lot more precise and deliberate in the ways that you're building a base. Whereas when you're doing a natural base, you kind of just want to throw things together and make them look like they're an accident. And that can be really freeing. You don't have to be too careful when you're picking out where to place rocks, because rocks kind of are all over the place if you're walking around your backyard. But if you want to make a spaceship deck, then there's going to be a lot of straight lines and hard edges and things like that. And that can be a little bit more intimidating to put together when you're not used to working with certain types of materials. But honestly, there are a lot of different ways that you can address that type of concern, and I think that it is worth giving it a shot and seeing what you can come up with when you're talking about bases like these. So a couple of different tricks that I've come up with is things like using styrene accessories. You can get these little like pipes and tubes and girders and things like that that all look like they're manufactured as they are, and you can kind of cut them out into the size you want to construct a base. The other thing is you can vary up the types of floors that you use. I find that using scale diamond plate is really cool to give it a little bit of a more industrial feel. And one of the things that I've used to really good effect, and this is only going to apply to certain games and certain armies, but decorative paper can actually be used to simulate a rug pretty effectively. You can find this in a lot of hobby stores, and it'll come in all sorts of different designs, and you can find one that kind of works with the theme that you're going for, and sometimes you can even add some paint to them and make it look like your character is kind of walking across a fancy carpet. The only thing that I'll warn when it comes to this is you do want to be a little bit more careful when you're working on a base like this, because as I said, you want to make sure that things look a little bit cleaner and a little bit neater, because you would expect a staircase or a ship deck to have straight lines, and things can't kind of be as broken or as muddled as they can be when you're talking about out in nature. Unless, of course, you're doing a ruined ship deck or something like that, where things are just in rubble piles and kind of jumbled together, and then you can get away with whatever you want. Now, I gotta be honest, jungle bases have been the bane of my existence for years, and it wasn't until this year, 2024, that I feel like I solved jungle bases. I've probably done a dozen iterations of jungle bases over the years, and I was never happy with them. I always hated the way that they came out. Jungles are really cool because they're a natural environment, but they're filled with all sorts of cool things, and they can work for a variety of different types of games, including fantasy and pulp and sci-fi and kind of everything in between. Jungles are everywhere. But I think that there were a couple of really key mistakes that I was making when I started working on jungle bases to begin with, and those things really held them back from looking like a real jungle environment. Now, the first thing is going back to tip number one, make sure you break up the ground texture. You don't want everything to just be flat. Jungles are typically not flat. You want to have a little bit of variety in there to break things up and make it look a lot more interesting. Getting a more natural look out of your jungle base is going to go a long way to convincing the viewer that it's actually something from a jungle and it's not just a person standing on a pile of painted sand. And that actually gets to the most important thing here, and that is I recommend not using sand as the base for your jungle bases. It used to be that my default was always to just slap sand down and then add things to it to change up the environment that the model is going to be standing in. But for a jungle base, you really don't want to start with sand, because if you look at pictures of jungles, you're going to find that a lot of times the jungle floor is covered in all sorts of stuff. Decaying plant matter, mud, shrubs, little puddles. There's going to be all sorts of different stuff. You're not just going to see open areas that are just dirt in a jungle, typically. Now, to get this effect on your miniature base, the thing that I decided to do was to get myself a little Tupperware container and just start filling it in with random basing materials. Now, this can run the gamut from static grass to flocking to little grass tufts, all the way up to sticks that you collect from your yard, crumbled up leaves. And maybe the most important and the most interesting one that I used was spices from the spice cabinet. If you have some old things of dried basil or oregano or any other type of spices in your cabinet, you can take those and dump them into this container and mix it in with all the other stuff. Throw in some grit and some sand, and eventually you'll have yourself a nice concoction of all sorts of cool, organic-looking matter. Now, I made a big container of this, and I've been using it for a bunch of jungle bases recently, and it's working really well. And the way that I would recommend you actually put this down onto the base is to use some sort of texture paste. Not only is this going to add a little bit of variety in the levels of the base, but it's also going to make it look a little bit more like mud or natural terrain instead of it, again, just being flat and sandy. So I have this big thing of Vallejo earth texture. I slap it down all over the base, and then I just pile on some of the stuff out of my little plant goodie bag. And what you're going to be left with is this really interesting looking jungle floor base. Now, the cool thing is you can just add other stuff on top of this. So if you want to have a tree stump or some terrarium plants or 3D printed plants or anything like that, you can just add them on top, and they're going to sink into the texture paste, and that's going to dry and hold them on pretty well. If it's something bigger, you might want to add a little bit of extra glue, but for the most part, you can just stick all that stuff in there and then be good to go. Now, once the texture paste is dried, I would definitely recommend sealing this with some watered down PVA glue. That way you don't just end up knocking off all of the little plant bits when you start trying to paint it. Now, depending on the type of material you use, you might be able to get away with just leaving this how it is. The cool thing about using the texture paste is that underneath it's going to be brown anyway, so you don't really have to worry too much about that. But what I like to do is go in and prime this like I normally would, and then give it a little zenithal highlight to bring out some of the colors on the top. After that, you can go in with something like a speed paint or a contrast paint or an ink or even washes and add back some of that color and richness to the plant matter. Definitely mix the colors up. You can get really sloppy and creative with this. Use some browns and some greens and maybe even some reds and whatever other colors that you want to mix in so that it looks more like a natural terrain. You can then go in and highlight it a little bit with a dry brush of a lighter color or a green, or if you want to get a little bit more creative, maybe you're on an alien planet, you can go nuts and add all sorts of different colors. It's a fun project and it's actually relatively simple to do. It takes a little bit of prep the first time to get your little goodie bag of plant matter set up and ready to go. But once you have it, it can be really easy to keep that on hand and just slap together a jungle base in a few minutes if you need to. I'm really proud of the way that my jungle bases have developed, and this is definitely the recipe that I'm going to be using going forward for anything like that. So those are 5 things not to do or 5 things to do, depending on how you want to frame it when it comes to making your miniature bases. Get that in the comments and let me know, do you like any of these tips or these things that you do yourself, or are there any other tips that you would give to somebody who's getting into doing some bases? Maybe things that you've learned the hard way and developed a different process for. Or what are some types of bases that you've tried a bunch in the past and never had any success with? Maybe some other folks can get down in the comments and give you some tips and help you develop the way that you make your bases. I've probably put together about 100 different bases in the past week, and I still have a whole bunch more on my desk over here, so I'm going to get right back to it. But before that, I just want to give a huge thank you to the extremely cool kids here on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatized, and Devin. And thanks for watching.